Previously on The Outsider.
Heath Hofstetter worked with Terry's father.
Maitland's wife and daughter said some guy.
The kid just walked in and says he needs to talk to you.
I lied last time we talked. I was scared of him.
Can you try to draw him?
I found another child killer who will cross paths with Heath Hofstetter. What he does can never be undone.
When you were a child, who were you told would come for you?
It takes what it wants.
It takes what it wants. It sounds like Jen.
No, I just took what I need.
Oh, is that what it is?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad I know that now. Hello, welcome to an all-new episode of Talking The Outsider. I am your host, Kinte, all the way live from Los Angeles, California. And I'm joined by my wonderful co-host, the one and only Jen. How you doing?
I think that should be my new nickname.
The one and only?
No, take what you need.
Yes.
Take
Yes.
what you need, Jen.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is exactly what your name should be, young lady.
It definitely suits me, I think.
All right. So we are yet again here for another episode. This is episode 5 of the TV series. And this episode was called Tear Drinker. So I think a good place to start off with this particular episode is the very beginning. Once again, we're having a little technical issue. We start off with another flashback, and in this flashback, we have someone's death already being foretold. Here we go. Sorry about that. And so this is one of those episodes where, kind of, I call it J.J. Abrams, where they show us the end, and then they show us how that we got there. So what do you think about this opening flashback?
Okay, so this is the only episode so far that I really didn't like. And I didn't like it, I guess, partly for that, because I felt like it was silly and contrived, and we didn't need that. But also because I am totally willing to be a part of a slow burn process where narrative ekes out bits at a time, and where we, sort of uncover things when it's done in service of developing the characters, because I do feel like that is really important. But this episode did sort of neither. The eking out of information was so slow and so incredibly almost painful in its delivery, and we didn't get anything as compensation. We didn't get, sort of a deeper, bigger character understanding. There were all additions to things, but there were all additions to things that we already knew. And I don't know, this episode in particular just really felt like a very weird, almost like a transition episode. I don't really understand why anything in this episode couldn't have been incorporated in other episodes, but it is what it is. Having said that, the one of the things that this show is really good at is basically showing us instead of telling us. And this definitely, the death of this person that we see at the beginning is definitely a big show that later Holly kind of uncovers as the episode goes along. What did you think? Did I lose you?
Sorry about that. I was on mute.
Ah.
So what this episode's used to show us kind of like this is where it's a lot about Jack Hoskins.
Well, it is. You're right. And again, I'm not. It's always so hard to criticize a series, especially when you like it. But this particular episode just felt like it was protracted to the point of it was painful. It was just painful.
You know, it's funny. This wasn't for me that, and there's another episode that we're gonna get to later that was kind of like that for me. But actually, I did enjoy this. I remember enjoying this episode, and one thing we get to see in this episode is kind of what the outsider or El Cuco or whatever you want to call him wants from Jack.
Right.
You know? So we see that he has Jack doing chores. You know, he's in this scene, he is getting a dead deer. He's setting up a living space for El Cuco in the middle of the woods. And we have Jack, you know, he's like, "Hey, I've done everything you want. Can you please just give me some relief?" And no, El Cuco still got that boot on his neck, if you will.
Right.
So I think that, you know, that particular, this is one thing that we get, and then we get it by showing us. So the way they're doing this is like, this is the future for Jack, right? By showing the character in the beginning who's connected to the Hostetler, storyline. So,
right. Ultimately, this is where you will end up.
Right.
It does, you know, it remarkably feels very like it's full of foreshadowing.
Oh.
It definitely feels that way.
Definitely. So we'll go back to that. One of the good images, I think, is in this particular episode is we go to Jeannie Anderson, and she's at work, and there's a guy with a hoodie on, and you're like, what is he coming for her at work? You know, like, what's going on here? You know, and
wait, let's preface this with Jeannie seems to have this strong connection to whatever it is that's going on, and she has been directly involved with the Maitland children in sort of uncovering what happened, whether, you know, the entity actually met. And again, you know, I am not of the opinion that something couldn't have been happening in the scene. Remember what we talked about before in a previous episode. There is a sense of dread that people get. Jack felt it when he went into the barn. There is a sense of dread that people get when this thing is around. And I think if you are particularly resonant to it, you will pick it up. And I feel like that's what was being said here about Jeannie.
Yeah. So you don't believe it was a psych out?
No, I think there actually was something happening. And I think it later clarifies itself because it visits her.
Yeah. So we might as well just go right on into the visit. So back at the Anderson home in the middle of the night, Jeannie Anderson gets a visit from the outsider. And I'll let you tell the audience what exactly the outsider told Jeannie.
Well, I should say it, because I don't know if it's actually a he. It does seem to prefer men over women just statistically, but we know that it doesn't really care because it was Maria too. So it seems to tell her that something big is going to happen. And the interesting thing to me is this is basically the same thing that Jessa told them as well. You know, if you don't stop, something bad is going to happen. And it makes me wonder if the entity honestly feels threatened by this, or if this is just not a further way to terrorize and bring up the kinds of chaotic grief and chaotic sadness and chaotic other stuff that is happening around them. Like, it almost felt like it appeared to Jessa to try to get Jessa to respond in a way that would, act with more grief, act with more sadness. And for all intents and purposes, it didn't, because Jessa was just too strong, or because the people around Jessa were strong enough to give her good counsel. And in this case, it also feels like it is trying to get Jeannie to somehow respond in a way that would give her dread, make her feel terrorized. And she does, for sure. But I feel like it's not actually trying to warn Ralph away as much as it's trying to create that kind of manifestation.
Right. And in case you thought it was a dream, we see that because she dropped it. We forgot to mention she drops the glass.
Right. She drops the glass.
And we see that her feet are all cut up from it. So, so it wasn't just a dream. But of course, Ralph doesn't believe that it happened. She believes it's a dream. And you can understand why. And she's very bothered by the fact that he doesn't believe her. So,
yeah,
and believe, remember, that's the theme. So,
and I think we should also remember that while Jeannie is getting visited by, the entity, because she's perhaps more resilient to this, Ralph is actually seeing visions of his dead son.
Right.
And so how this thing is complicated in terms of what emotions and what it's playing off of it just feels very overwhelming.
Right. So yeah, this is that's interesting too. Like, is that from his own mind, seeing his dead son, or is that I don't think the outsider is doing that, right?
Well, at this point, it doesn't matter. And I feel like that's what we get to here. What we get to here is there's enough chaotic influence happening that it doesn't matter what is manifesting to who. What matters is that there is this pervasive sense of grief and sadness and dread around all of them. Because if that's what it's feeding off of, I don't think it cares whether it's making the physical manifestation or whether it's simply bringing up enough emotion to swirl that, to make that a reality for him.
Right. Going back to Holly is now on trying to figure out more about the Hostetter case. And she goes to this gravesite because she has the conversation with the bartender. And it was this episode, I'm sorry, where she offers to, she gets the bartender to drive her around. And they take her to this gravesite because they come to this understanding that maybe this thing may want to hang around the gravesite to drink the tears, the emotions, the grief that's going on. And that's a great sight. And while she's there, she runs into the man we see who
dead guy
at the very beginning. He's at the gravesite, and he has the markings on the back of his neck that Jack Hoskins has.
It's also interesting that right after the scene, they go to the house where Heath's home was, and the bed being made was it's such an interesting thing because there's definitely a little psychology going on in terms of like maybe it has a little twinge of care for its victims. Maybe there's something a little bit more psychological happening here, but my feeling about, and always has been about, this entity is that the entity itself is smart enough to know that it can't act in total malice on its own, because that would not get it what it wants. It has to have these bouts of empathy, or perceived empathy. It has to have these bouts of let me take your pain away, not just let me drink from your grief. Because that's what keeps people believing is let me take your pain away. Let me help you see maybe, this is good. And in the book, the entity actually doesn't the entity actually cure somebody's cancer?
Yes. Well,
Or promises to.
promises. That's the book, though.
Yeah, well, right. But what I'm saying is like that you can see that there is definitely a parallel here. There's a correlation between, and the bed was, I think, the perfect. It really was a good. It was a good visual high point to show that.
Yeah. And another thing too is, Holly starts to get this idea that possibly something like this, the events that happened around Heath's case, could potentially be the same around Terry's case. So
Right.
she has Ralph go to the gravesite where Terry's buried and just take photos around. And while they're doing that, as Yoon is there, Glory Maitland is there, as well as Jeannie. And that's when they made the realization that the barn in which they found the clothes and where El Cuco made his encounter with Jack Hoskins is right there next to the gravesite. And the idea behind that is he wanted to be close to the grief, because that's what he feeds off of, right?
Well, and again, not to keep sort of beating this over the head, but it does speak to this higher level of intelligence that this thing is smart enough to know it's not just mindlessly feeding off of. It's very calculated. It really is playing a long game, which is very terrifying.
Yeah. Very, very terrifying. And you're like, okay, what the heck is going on here? So, and I'm trying to pull up a clip because I want to have this where people can see just the image. Should be good enough. We also have, and we haven't talked about Betsy Riggins. I'm sorry, she's Tamika Collins. I'm sorry. In this, I'm going
right with the baby.
And the baby who is partners with Jack. Right. And so she's just had a baby and she's possibly having a dream. And in the dream, she sees a hooded figure. She sees this hooded figure over the crib. And I believe he takes the baby too, right? Mm-hmm. So, and when she wakes up and it was just totally a dream, or was it a dream?
Well, right, or was it? That's a good question.
So why do you think, why do you think they put this scene in here? I'm trying to.
Well, my understanding is that our outsider is now seeing through the eyes of Jack, and it makes just too much of a tempting target for outsider not to try to participate in that moment in some way. Now, what happens though, to sort of maybe thwart it just a little bit, is Jack refusing to follow the baby. I mean, to hold the baby. And it seems to me like maybe it's sort of like Jack is pushing back, and somehow the entity is trying to maybe utilize that relationship even further or even more to its benefit by saying, do you see how easy it is for me to sort of get in here? I don't know if it communicated, and obviously we don't know if it's communicating with Jack directly about that, but that's my feeling. My feeling is that that's what it would have showed Jack, to say, see, if you don't do what I want you to do, this is the suffering that I'm able to inflict on those around you.
Right, because he doesn't want to take, he doesn't want to touch the baby because he's afraid of what could happen.
Exactly.
Right. So we have a scene where Jack as well as Ralph come together, and he starts to say that he wants to be involved and try to help and make amends for things that he's done in the past and just be a better detective. And they kind of have a heart-to-heart conversation with each other. And so I know there was a lot of confusion online. I remember when this episode came out, where people thought that it was The Outsider.
Oh.
Where I thought that was, I'm thinking like, oh, these people don't really get it, but no, that is Jack, and he's working off of his imperative, which he needs to do.
Well, he's trying to get information from he's basically trying to get information in any way that he can, and part of being quote unquote punished by the entity is every time that happens, something bad happens to Jack, and it makes him come back with more ferocity about doing what he can, craftily, sneakily, whatever, to get more for the entity, for El Coco, because he is suffering so much for it. So I to me, it makes total sense that Jack would try to pry information from, really from anybody, but specifically because he was sitting there talking to him, it just seems to make a lot of sense.
Yeah. And then we also get an answer to the beginning setup of how Tracy Powell, who is the man from the opening flashback, and who also Holly ran into at the gravesite, what happened to him.
And he's also the one that made the bed.
Right, he made the bed as well. Yeah. And he shipped the bed later. But he basically commits suicide by cop. And he creates a standoff where he didn't have any bullets in his gun, and he is murdered by the police. And that is the end of his story, which is, I'm sure, is the idea of it is foreshadowing what possibly is going to happen with Jack. So, you mentioned one more thing I feel like we got to get to in this episode. You mentioned it, and I was trying to save that a little bit for later, but the episode ends with a visit from Derek,
right,
their son, the Anderson son, and which is obviously, this is not in the book because the son is still alive in the novel, and on the TV show, he has this vision of his dead son. And so I think in the next episode, I feel like we need to go more in depth into what that means, and when we do come back and do it. But I think this was a nice ending to this episode. Don't you think?
Well, it definitely seems to speak to the, first of all, the lack of closure that Ralph has about the death of his son. That's a big one. But secondly, how easy it is to poke at Ralph's grief. It's very easy because it's so unresolved, and it's just all right there. I mean, there was a scene earlier in one of the episodes where Jeannie is actually packing up some toys to bring over to the Maitland kids. And Ralph can't even bring himself to go in the room. He just says, well, I'll just leave you to whatever you're doing, without questioning anything, because he just can't. He just cannot deal with it at all on any level. And I feel like that's actually sort of what keeps Ralph from being able to believe anything as well. He's just rooted sort of in his own trauma at that time. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, these are broken people and a lot of grief, a lot of unresolved issues, and
Let's say one thing too before we leave this episode, and that is that I keep mentioning like little technical things, but this one definitely gives me a sense of it's very interesting the way that they're doing this. There's so much bass in all of the background music that happens that sometimes it almost it feels sometimes it feels droning, which can make you feel dreadful inside. But when there's a lot of bass in something, it also acts as kind of like an excitement. And the excitement is definitely rooted in fear. So they did a really genius thing by creating these sort of always off key moments that are punctuated with this bass that just makes you feel like there's some resonant horror happening at all times. It's just really fascinating. The music is maybe because this episode was so slow for me, I actually really paid a lot of attention to it. But I actually have notes about how the background music made me feel.
oh, did you get up and dance?
No, I don't. I don't usually dance to fear. That's not usually my thing.
All right. Well, I think this is a good place to end. Because we're we're walking a tightrope without trying to ruin it for people who are just trying to keep in line with the episodes. But I feel like we're going to be unleashed pretty soon. So I want to first start off by how can we get you in social media and all that good stuff?
You can find me at Following Bliss1 on Twitter, and you can check out my websites at my newly moved website for where I am doing story deconstruction at studiowhitewolf.com. And of course, there is my Movies Make the Meal website with lots of cool recipes that tie into all kinds of movies.
All right. And you can get me at Kinte F on Twitter, Kinte Ferguson at Instagram, and of course the website is indyradio.org. That's INDY radio.org. And we'll catch you next time right here for an all new episode of Talking the Outsider. Peace.